I found it more noticeable than ever at the end of 2024 how many social media accounts and apps are really trying to get in on the whole deliver a cohesive through line through this year of your life. And as in most cases, it utterly failed to do so. So I felt less compelled than ever to try and bring a cohesive through line to all the films I saw this year. I saw plenty of them. I had various thoughts, some very brief and incohesive, others very lengthy and admittedly still very incohesive. So here they all are. Thoughts on every film I saw this year, in absolutely no order. Happy New Year. One quick note, this is thoughts on all the films I've seen this year except the ones I've already reviewed. If you'd like to see those, please do visit my channel. Thanks very much. Proof, if proof was needed, that having your camera ramp back and forth in conjunction with the movement of the subject's body does not evoke a sense of momentum. So am I the only one who rather appreciated the way they reworked the power and responsibility theme into this film? That being said, when you're building up to a climax to a story set entirely in New York, and the climax is also New York based, a 10-minute jaunt to Peru isn't advisable. With the exception of one ill-advised turn of the millennium remake, Planet of the Apes remains the franchise that still refuses to fall back on its laurels. You still see the seams of the original pentalogy in where the events are heading, but Kingdom has established itself in a point in time still far removed from them, and seems far happier charting its own course through themes of revenge, the shifting hands of power, and historical interpretation and imitation. Waiting for the traditional moment in this type of story, wherein Priscilla Presley seizes control of her circumstances and learns to effectively find her function in Elvis's life and assert herself in front of him more, is one of the most effectively frustrating waits for a moment that never comes, revealing this biopic to be a tragedy of someone fully robbed of their opportunity and agency for so much of their life. Petition for this film crew to direct the inevitable Luigi Mangione biopic? Remember when Deadpool joked that Celine Dion needed to bring it down from an 11 to a 4, and when she refused, he said that they should have gotten NSYNC? Well, they went with NSYNC for the opening of Versus Wolverine, and he was spot on. It's a 4, at best. Anybody other than George Miller would have made the events playing out in Furiosa feel like an overlong montage, but he actually commits to the word saga. It's almost a defiant antithesis to Fury Road in its structure, but also a fierce reinforcement of its themes. Dev Patel has a keen eye for framing and blocking action, as seen in Monkey Man's climax, when his character has come full circle. A shame that he thinks a good way to present his conflicted sensibilities earlier in the film is not simply to show him fail in combat with the same clarity, but instead to frame the action in a shakier, unfocused manner. I obviously can't speak for mothers, individually or collectively, but I have to assume that these depictions of a mother's dedication to their children is more demeaning than empowering, given how Anne Hathaway and Jessica Chastain's characters' willingness to do anything for their sons is pretty much synonymous with clinical insanity. What separates films with a monotonous tone from films with consistent tones? Dunno, but I think this one is the latter. Case by case basis, of course, but I'm also a sucker for the waking nightmare atmosphere that constantly throws hints to the idea that the lead actress, or perhaps everyone in the film, are already condemned to hell or purgatory or just a nightmare, reminiscing, regretting, and reckoning with their actions. Wow, Earth, Wind and Fire really is good in any scenario, isn't it? The one thing it hadn't been utilised as was a climactic tearjerker, and now it's got that going for it too. I only realised while watching this how few biker films I've seen, but also how I feel through cultural osmosis that this feels like it's going through all the familiar beats of a typical biker film. Is there anything especially distinctive about this film's take on bike gang culture of the 50s? My only in is that I saw Wild Hogs back in 2010, and even that felt relatively in sync with the Bikeriders thematically. It seems that the three tales are primarily connected by an ironic subversion of the title, in which blasé and circumstantial actions provoke unrelenting sadness, anger, and apathy. They're also connected by a permanent tonal veneer of sarcasm that's usually present in Lanthimos' work, but in a feature-length narrative tends to evolve and adjust throughout the runtime more so than it does here. So the villain's plan is to bring back and imitate what came before her in hopes of being successful. It's sad enough that the film is practically confessing their motivations for making a fourth Kung Fu Panda. Not quite as sad as the fact that they couldn't even successfully bring back everything, because DreamWorks didn't want to pay millions upon millions more to get Jolie, Oldman et al. To come back for a line or two each. So what if we did try to fake it? It only makes the fact that we really did it all the more meaningful. What? It's tricky enough when one organization tries to promote themselves by admitting some of their more charming faults and glorifying their product while ignoring their more unforgivable practices, but Fly Me to the Moon is trying to pull that off for the very concept of marketing. Rumours is a sort of anti-conclave, supplying political commentary but determined to detach itself entirely from pointing the finger too directly at contemporary events. And even with abstract concepts such as sentient giant brains, zombie bog bodies, and a sentient AI being crammed into one location, while the G7 world leaders get dropped in the middle and treated like teen campers in an average slasher film, the pettiness, obliviousness, and incompetence of the leaders as they encounter each of these bizarre happenings does effectively communicate a sense of doom at the systemic ineptitude of our current order. What a clever idea to take a combat sport, the fundamentals of which involve taking and distributing extreme physical harm in the pursuit of personal glory, and juxtapose it with a wrestling family and the pressure and abuse put onto them to do themselves and their loved ones irreparable harm in the pursuit of vain glory. What a poetic concept. Thank God it's not actually a common occurrence in real life that really casts a dark shadow over the legacy of sport entertainment. Did anybody else think Ryan Reynolds was Bee's grandfather? Fiona Shaw's husband? That's kind of the next step I was waiting if to take, that it never really does. Reconciling the imagination and the hopes of youth with the loss and hardship of growing up. As is, it's mostly just here to celebrate the former. Okay. I definitely thought at the time that the first two films took way more advantage of the setup than Day One did, and yet now I definitely remember way more about Day One. One thing that I think that is owed to, if you took these characters out of the plot, took us back before Day One, I'd much rather watch a film about Lupita, Joseph, and Jaimon than I would the family from the first two films. And Lupita just wanted a pizza. In a film where the lines between reality and fiction blur and it becomes unclear who exists in the world and who are simply characters in a book, Matthew Vaughn attempts to set up a cinematic universe where it's unclear who exists and who is a work of fiction within the universe. Well, it's a bold strategy, let's see if it pays off. Oh, it hasn't. The episodic journey film I thought Secret Life of Pets was going to be. It's been a little eclipsed by DreamWorks' big end-of-the-year film also featuring a migration plot that reduced audiences the world over to tears, but I think Illumination are onto something with basically getting the character arcs mostly out of the way in the opening and then just playing around with one shenanigan after the other. If Pets was their attempt at Toy Story, Migration is their Aristocats, and honestly, that one was more in need of a modern update. I was fully prepared to give Ride or Die the exact same assessment as Bad Boys for Life. Adil and Bilal are sound directors. More functional than Bay, but with enough flair that they still imbue this with a hint of his style. But without the sheer ugly nihilism that Bay brought to the table with Bad Boys 2, these sequels can't help but feel like lifeless dime-a-dozen buddy cop films by comparison. I was fully prepared to say all that, but that Reggie Norman scene, I did not know I needed that, but hats off to everyone involved. I cannot ignore a character payoff that delightful. A lot of people thought that Garland confessing that he wished to step away from directing was an ill-advised topic of conversation for Civil War's marketing campaign. especially as many were struggling to gauge what the exact political statement of this near future ununited states was. It turns out these statements were the greatest hint at what the film was really about. A celebrated photojournalist who has lost all faith that their work has had any actual impact on the world whatsoever, and now simply goes through the motions of their career, teaching an aspiring up-and-comer to treat them less like an idol and more like a cog in a machine that they will one day replace. A testament to starting your revenge action flick on the right motivational foot. A highly trained former agent wanting to avenge a scammed elderly neighbor may not be as broadly accessible as Taken's abducted daughter anxiety trip, but it sets Jason Statham on a much sturdier path than the speculative, stereotypical drudge of Taken and its imitators. There's a familiarity right off the bat to the fury and disgust evoked by the scammer's moral detachment and greed-embellishing groupthink. Enough so that you'll willingly follow Statham, trace the paper trail to the most absurd heights, so long as he continues to beat the shit out of everyone he meets along the journey. The final proof needed that tennis and racket sports in general are the best sports to watch. The one-on-one adversarial nature, the only pauses being in between the states of play, the rapid back and forth of the action. As great as the actors are, and as effective a director as Guadagnino is when it comes to the non-sports scenes, don't tell me you'd find any of this half as compelling if every few minutes we cut back to a football match. Either kind. One Love doesn't cram all of Marley's life story into the narrative. It does, however, include both his assassination attempt and cancer diagnosis, with two confrontations with his mortality mixed in with his calls to peace in Jamaica, recording Exodus, and his relationship with his family. You'd think you'd be in for one of the more focused musical biopics in the last few years, with rich themes about personal legacy, spiritualism, and political activism. But it just goes to show that unless you actually establish a cohesive thread through these elements, moving from scene to scene can all still just feel like chapters in a Wikipedia entry. I maintain that Inside Out remains one of the most delicately handled balancing acts of reality and metaphor in all of Pixar, if not film in general. The sequel keeps that up, but reinforces that keeping the balance means sacrificing all subtlety in any respect, and the change in story from the necessity of a level of sadness to the maintenance of a healthy level of anxiety means that naturally the tears of film 1 are replaced with cringe. But intentional cringe, at least. When you think about it, isn't this kind of a Stealth Predator remake, just with low-level criminals instead of soldiers? I get the feeling that when producers hired Eli Roth, they were hoping for similar results as Gunn's Guardians of the Galaxy and Suicide Squad, or even Rodriguez's Elite Battle Angel. And if they'd simply told him, do what you want with this, they may have gotten a very interestingly cruel and degraded film. A similar pleasant surprise as the aforementioned films. But I think what he was probably told instead was, do what Gunn and or Rodriguez did. And the result was this film. A moderate little scandal besieging a quiet town should be an exposé. Wicked Little Letters wasn't sold as a David Lynch film by any means, but it teased the notion that the foul-mouthed letters would bring all the brimming ugliness of the quaint village to the surface. Instead, most of the village's unsavory traits are already public knowledge. It's an environment where everyone visibly despises one another but doesn't want to be the rude one who breaks the day-to-day tedium, which is the sole cause of Jessie Buckley's character receiving the scorn she does. But with the insulting letters at the center of the plot, you'd expect them to be more disruptive, to break everyone out of their routine, shake up the systematic run-through. In the end, the capture of the culprit seems to only suggest that their only chance at happiness is to escape this environment. The village is a hive mind of tedium and casual oppression. To stay there is to die in placid misery. How do you make Middle America engage with environmentalism and stopping climate change? Combine it with off-road adrenaline chasing and rodeo. No, I don't think that's actually in any way advisable. I'm honestly a little shocked that it worked in the context of a disaster movie blockbuster, and yet the numbers don't lie. I've spent the last 20 years or so sleeping on M. Night Shyamalan due to blindly believing the consensus around his films. I'll be damned if I do the same thing again now that his daughter's directing. Ishana is still developing her style at this point in her career. She's more conventional than M. Night Shyamalan in a lot of respects, and who knows, plenty of people may see that as a good thing, but I'm looking forward to seeing her cut loose in future films. What is present is her father's penchant for eerie folklore and creepy mysteries as a vessel for something deeply personal, namely anxieties of intense scrutiny coupled with feelings of imposter syndrome and self-imposed isolation. The coupling of the supernatural with the subtext is a little slipshod, but still relatively affecting. Turns out that if you remove alcoholism from the proceedings, The Shining could have been a perfectly heartwarming tale of bonding, mending, and creating new familial ties, and re-evaluating measurements of success and how perceived successes and failures predetermine the end of one's life, worth, and capacity for joy and fulfillment. All brought about from being stuck with a couple of other people in an empty estate over the winter. Whether all of that would have felt as warm with Jack Nicholson in the lead is another question altogether, of course. What initially felt like it would be David Litch's callback and love letter to his stunt performing and coordinating days, in actuality feels like his ultimate declaration that he's a Hollywood director now first and foremost. It isn't just because his very workmanlike shooting and cutting undermines the impact of all these real stunts. It's because the story turns out not to be about the undervalued stuntman rediscovering his personal worth, but instead about him learning to put everything on the line so that the director can achieve their ultimate vision. Now, as a rom-com, Ryan Gosling going above and beyond to respect and provide what Emily Blunt wants and needs is lovely. But it was all the same a darkly hilarious moment when I realised this film about a stuntman spent more time honouring the role the director plays in a production, as if we don't already have a million of those. The double whammy of Immaculate and First Omen using ancient religious orders with dark secrets as a vessel to comment on women being robbed of their autonomy and used as unwilling pregnancy surrogates, lining up with the escalation in attacks on abortion rights is probably not a coincidence. And I'm here for that. I'd take plenty more of them, provided that the films are as interestingly distinct from one another in the minute details as these two are. With Immaculate, the sinister nature of the institution is much more sci-fi rooted. On one hand, encouraging us to look at the systemic cruelty not as an outdated practice, being eroded by a more sensible modern society, but as an ongoing corruption of power not inherently linked with any one institution. On the other hand, the genetic experimentation aspects sometimes feel more like it's seeking to frame these evils as more modern practices, warping older, more sacred doctrines. The first Omen, on the other hand, dives into the supernatural horror of the original Omen, but through it broadcasts the pervasiveness and inescapable feeling of internal corruption. The more vibrant imagery and surrealistic suspense allows for a more varied atmosphere than the consistent jump scares and muted, dim aesthetic of Immaculate. The only time it doesn't manage to pop as well as Immaculate, for lack of a better term, is when it comes to the final scenes. The first Omen has one hell, again for lack of a better term, of a climax, but its final scene is restricted by its status as a franchise entry. Meanwhile, Immaculate takes its pro-choice message to the ultimate extreme in its final moments. Definitely the most pronounced and memorable moment. You don't lend a lot of thought to the emotional effect of framing devices until you see an example of a framing device utterly devoid of emotional effect. Despite a lovely score, having the story set up by an old man watching a rowing team do adequately well and one kid utterly fail, staring into space while supposedly thinking, I used to do that, really doesn't give you much of an in into what you can expect from the story being shaped by his perspective. Although that winds up being quite representative of this film's perspective on anything. Not that I find that there's anything wrong with somebody just reminiscing about how much they enjoyed being on a rowing team, but you kind of expect things to build a little bit given some of the events that take place near the end of this film. You can practically hear the mostly disinterested old man saying, and then we competed in the Olympics, in Nazi Germany. Pretty fun. I even met Jesse Owens. Not gonna lie, there seemed to be a lot more on his mind than the 8 of us combined. I'm sure he's got a hell of a story to tell. I'm torn between two desires following the second film to feature King Kong and Godzilla. One of which is bring in more monsters, I don't know what the situation is with the American rights to Gamera, but I really want a MonsterVerse Gamera film and a Godzilla crossover. The other is a return to singular monster movies. As much as I do love to indulge in the brazen punch 'em up ballistics of the crossovers, I am growing increasingly appreciative of Kong Skull Island and especially Gareth Edwards' Godzilla. Especially following the surprise impact of -1. In any case, I think we're at the saturation point for Godzilla and Kong discovering things, fighting and teaming up while reinforcing the unstoppable force of nature themes for Godzilla and subverting the tragic victim of colonialism themes of Kong by giving him a new home and family. What is everybody talking about with that final act? That's when he's the most trapped. Don't get me wrong, following the serial killer trying to escape the concert undetective is a lot of fun. Shyamalan and Hartnett both having an absolute blast with the setup. But getting out and following him home fully fleshes out Cooper as a tragically well-established character. Realizing the extent to which he not only recognizes his apple pie family life is an ideal cover, but something he truly loves and wants to protect from any connection to his other life is mesmerizing work from Hartnett. Riding a fine line between legitimate regrets for the distance he has put between himself and his family, and putting unrealistic expectations on their wholesomeness to validate him and detach him from his darker self. Oh come on, Villeneuve, Trainspotting made babies terrifying on a minuscule budget all the way back in 1996. I waited 5 hours plus 3 years to see Stellan Skarsgård stare down one of the children of the damned, only to find that you thought it'd be less silly to keep Aaliyah as a telepathic fetus for the whole runtime. Aside from that, Part 2 is definitely a stylistic upgrade from Part 1, and certainly more interested in making sure that all the colonialism subtext of the book is simply presented as text. I remember sharing my feelings of futility on this matter with a friend, saying something like, I read the book not too long ago and I don't know what everyone's going on about. I don't think it's ambiguous at all that Paul's journey is a negative for the universe at large. To which my friend, who'd only seen the new films, responded, Paul overthrowing the Emperor is a bad thing? Okay, maybe not so futile after all. That bit at the end where Monk has to come up with an ending on the fly really felt like the screenwriter telling on himself. I definitely appreciate the details that reflect on the frustration felt about how, to this day, any form of African American cultural identity still feels like it is inevitably untethered from and filtered to white Americans. But I worry that in a case such as this, ending the film with the same level of defeatist melancholy that it started with may come across as more dismissive than it was likely intended, and perhaps betrays a subconscious intention for the film itself to cater more for white liberal audiences than a black audience. But maybe I only feel that way because, yes, I cringe laughed at all the appropriate moments, i.e., any time a white character said anything. A lot of stories have characters profess out loud what an unmanageable mess they are, but few actually show you the gritty details like Love Lies Bleeding does. I assume most people worry that if you actually see all the ways in which the protagonists are such destructive fools, you'll lose all empathy for them. I can't speak for everyone else, but the opposite is true for me. Katie O'Brien and Kristen Stewart are so clearly products of their environment and engineers of their own demise. Roseglass really gets that those are not mutually exclusive, and rather hammers home the tragedy that existing in such a brutal and unforgiving landscape makes you feel prohibited from going your own way and making your own mistakes, which only makes them hurt all the more when you do, because everybody does. At the heart of that is a relationship that is also probably completely dysfunctional and doomed. But for the good it does the two of them at the moment, of course they're going to hold on to it until they simply can't anymore. Between this and Zola, I would never have guessed what a gentle soul Coleman Domingo appears to be, and went on to present in films like Sing Sing. So good is he at portraying such an unforgivably cruel soul. Or at least I thought unforgivable, but anyone who's seen this film knows how it ends. I am rather taken with the way Blitz Bazawule and Fantasia handle the forgiveness, though. It's handled about as delicately on the surface as the ending of It Ends With Us, but it seems more conscious of the true cruelty behind Mister's actions, never implying that regardless of anything else they learn, the blame doesn't rest squarely with him. Celie's offer of friendship doesn't stem from an eagerness to make amends, but from a bittersweet understanding of how her recent progress, liberation, and happiness have not led to grassier plains. It's very likely that she, her friends and family, and even Mister will endure worse in the future, and no matter how hard, it's through the bonds of a community that shares in the suffering that they will persevere. It's tricky to determine whether an Amy Winehouse biopic could ever not feel like a PR meddling fiasco. Celebrities either live to sanitize all the gory details of their life story, or their next of kin's excessive input ignites speculation of how their personal agendas taint the memory of the subject. The latter was at the center stage of all conversation around Back to Black, with the affectionate portrayals of Amy Winehouse's dad and husband taking attention away from the music and substance abuse, which especially feel like footnotes towards the end of the film, where the rehab singer goes to rehab for one scene before directly moving on to winning Grammys for Back to Black and Rehab. It was the scenes with Amy's grandmother, especially the final farewell before she passed away, where both characters appear to know it's the last time they'll see one another, that gave me the impression that the main interest was to present this story as Amy at the end of her life, drifting through all the key events of her past, wishing to reflect and achieve closure with as little conflict as possible. We're all very aware and in awe of the hard work that goes into stop motion animation. 2 to 3 seconds of footage per day. Yet sometimes I worry that it comes across that admiring the effort going into the craft is the only thing stop motion has going for it. But the continuing lack of shortcuts that can be taken in this kind of production compared to other feature film productions translates onto the screen. So many washed out, concrete hued, flatly blocked blockbusters have been overshadowed by the dramatic lighting and dynamism of a film made out of clay. And while the model train scene of the wrong trousers may never be topped, I'm still in awe of Aardman's ability to apply the language of high stakes chase scenes from various eras of action cinema to the quaint environment of British suburbia. Margaret Qualley is back for Ethan Coen and Trisha Cook's next installment in their lesbian B-movie trilogy, and I hope it's even goofier than this. I know Qualley's racking up the nominations for The Substance, but honestly, we're in short supply of Hollywood A-listers really willing to push and flex their more undisciplined, chaotic, and uncomfortable muscles. She absolutely commits to being the most extreme comic foil to Geraldine Viswanathan's straight man, and given that her next counterpart may well be a very dry femme fatale played by Aubrey Plaza, I hope Qualley delivers something on par with Pitt in Burn After Reading or Nelson in Oh Brother Where Art Thou. It may not be as focused as Love Lies Bleeding on this front, but Cohen and Cook, as well as Qualley and Viswanathan, understand that the messier the couple at the centre are, as they get dumped, beaten up, and utterly fail to execute a half-baked scheme, the more you really root for them getting together, because bless their hearts, they need something positive in their lives. It maybe would have been too on the nose for an otherwise subtle film like Zone of Interest to draw direct parallels between the Holocaust and future atrocities such as apartheid and genocide in the same way Black Klansman ended with footage from the modern day. But I think the only thing really missing from this is the sheer, seemingly endless length of time that those who benefit from abusing human rights can go on maintaining their show of indifference to the suffering they encourage and profit from. It's hard to get too particular about that, though, given how uncompromising it is in its inhumane display of willful ignorance, how familiar it looks, how early we're indoctrinated, and how it in no way absolves or differentiates those who sit by from those who directly enact the mass torture, enslavement, and slaughter of innocents. Actually, it's Frankenstein's monster, the doctor is Frankenstein, the old argument goes. But in Lisa Frankenstein, the debate is made increasingly confusing, as the titular character bears the name and fully developed cognitive abilities of the Doctor, but also suffers the ostracism and disillusionment with humanity usually experienced by the monster. Not quite as viciously as the monster's torment is, of course. It's not even Carrie levels of cruelty she experiences. It's decidedly mundane in a sickening way, combining the casual displays of teasing and mockery from peers with moments of attempted assault and cartoonish torment from an evil stepmother, seeking to dismiss the idea that singular actions push people to the anger and melancholy felt by Lisa. It's a day-to-day grind. Her moulding of the creature into an ideal vessel for companionship, and using him as a tool for murder, isn't universally justifiable or unjustifiable, but a tragic final act of someone so defeated into believing that there is no place for her in anyone else's life. Who'd have thought a film called Nightbitch would be the exception to the comment I just made about depictions of motherhood on film? I'm not sure that a lot of the revelations Amy Adams' character shares throughout the film about womanhood or motherhood can really be described as anything more than platitudes, but they are balanced out by the actions she takes to retake control of her life being fairly unique. It is still something of a rarity to see separation as a positive unless it's juxtaposed with uncompromisingly evil behavior that justifies the desire to escape. Mother, oh hey, you never learn her name, is somewhat like Lisa of Lisa Frankenstein in that the isolation and misery she feels isn't spurred on by largely traumatizing or oppressive elements in her life, but by the mundane routines and expectations put upon her. Although in Mother's case, it's something she recognizes as a common feeling among so many people like her. The metamorphosis starts as a very familiar excuse for escaping societal trappings by embracing the creature of instinct that we all are at heart, but refreshingly refutes that by recognizing that bestial behavior alone neglects so many things that we have come to value. Hell, we wouldn't even have a concept of value. Instead, it develops into a story about domestication, but in a way that encourages a fair share in responsibility, labor, and emotional toll. A recognition that no matter how much you want to have a family and hold on to that family, the union of two people and the birth of children are both unspoken vows to offer up a level of your personal freedom, and that needs to be as even-handed a sacrifice as humanly possible if it is ever to work. I certainly expected the original film, but with music, and that's mostly what I got. What I didn't expect was for the musical version to be less cartoony than the original. Mostly that's just a sad indictment of the way mainstream filmmaking has changed over the last 20 years. Even when characters break out into song, the aesthetics of the world stay toned down and unexaggerated. It doesn't have to be that way these days, of course. Here We Go Again wasn't as mentally deranged as the first Mamma Mia, but it was still expressive. The camera still mostly felt like it was trying to pull you in and get you invested. The exaggeration and looniness of Mean Girls is what highlights not just the absurdity, but the finitum of everything going on. This is high school stuff, important to that stage of your life. And with everything so much more toned down and quote unquote realistic, Mean Girls 2024 offers the alternative idea that this bitchy, backhanded drama is what you need to expect going forward into the rest of your life. Everything to do with familiar relationships in this film is as devastating as intended. Call me heartless though, the ending twist falls flat precisely because it's framed as a twist. Spending the majority of Adam's runtime reconciling with his past to give him some grasp on himself in the present, the story with Harry really needed to tie into that in some way. As is, it risks pulling us out of the vague fantasy trappings of Adam's time travelling simply being a surreal presentation of his reflecting on his own life, by instead making it all seem like a tangible Sixth Sense-esque ability that he needs to question how he acquired it. If the ending to Harry's story had simply been integrated in another way, and perhaps earlier into the story, I think the ties to Adam's own sadness and doubts and demons would have hit harder, and drawn a more emphatic line through the relationship of Adam and Harry, as well as emphasised more what has changed for Adam over the course of the film. Okay, that's the prologue done. When does the film start? The coming-of-age and autonomy tale of Bella Baxter on the surface appears to have more connections with the story of Tarzan than the more aesthetically familiar Frankenstein, as Bella is flung into a society in the form of a fully grown adult, but entirely unindoctrinated to said society's standards of normalcy. Unlike the King of the Jungle, though, Bella is a blank slate with no previous customs clashing with her newfound surroundings. Educated as quickly as possible on surface-level etiquette, Bella freely travels the world, unaccustomed to the attitudes to sex, gender, and class, and is instantly dismissive of nonsensical double standards rather than stunned by them. The knee-jerk rejection of injustices and the subsequent calm rebellion Bella takes to is an instinctively pleasurable viewing experience, seeing the cruelty behind the niceties meeting their undoing by someone who employs all the same niceties, both instinctively and deceptively. The only trouble with this, of course, is that Yorgos Lanthimos and Tony McNamara are not blank slates with a flippant perspective on societal norms. They are perhaps active rebels against them, but susceptible to them all the same, which throws into question the exact course of the journey they choose to lead Bella on, namely how much the story still puts sex so front and center in her journey. Nevertheless, I think both filmmakers have a decent grasp on the fact that they are as incapable as anyone of having the necessary detachment from their upbringing to fully analyze and confront the imbalance and rotten absurdity of the world they live in. To that effect, I think Mark Ruffalo's character may be the most important figure Bella encounters in her journey, and probably the figure that both writer and director most subconsciously identify with, and perhaps most viewers. He is the ultimate depressed husk of every one of us that wishes to rage against the machine while existing in it, desperately trying and failing to understand why Bella manages it so much better than us. Thank you very much for watching, and once again, a very happy new year to you all. This is my first time actually just recording a closing message, because I'm legitimately worried that it'll just sound incredibly robotic to ask you to like, share, and subscribe. But at the same time, it felt equally robotic to just leave a message up. So yeah, please do just like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It would be greatly appreciated. Obviously, visit the channel, you'll find yourself plenty more reviews. In the previous months, I dedicated the channel to doing individual reviews for every film I saw, every new film I saw. But I'd be very interested to know what you think about this kind of video compared to the individual ones. For January, I'm also going to just type out my reviews as I see each film and then bring them all together for a end of the month video, either at the very end of January or the beginning of February. But I would be very interested to know which kind of video you prefer. Multiple videos a week on each film, or a collection at the end of the month. And with that, I have rambled enough. So once again, thank you very much for watching.